whose name is William Blacker, is ill and unable to join us today. So we've already used the book signing to add something like a coffee break to our agenda, and we might break a little bit early to go to lunch earlier today. But I'd like to introduce Maria Lecke, who's the chair of Slavic Literatures at Ruhr University in Bochum. She studied and worked in Münster, St. Petersburg, Moscow, Krakow, and Berkeley. And her academic interests include Russian literature of the imperial and post-Soviet periods in post-colonial perspective, cosmopolitanism and modernism in Odessa, as well as the Polish literature of the Enlightenment and post-communist eras. And today she is talking about Agnieszka Holland's film The Spoor in No Country for Old Women.
Thank you very much. Well, my paper is again about Olga Tokarczuk. She will be mentioned in the second part of my paper. Tokarczuk wrote the novel that out of which Agnieszka Holland and Tokarczuk herself developed the script for Spoor, Pokot in Polish. I will give you shortly the storyline of the film. It is about Janino Doszejko, a retired civil engineer. She lives in seclusion in a mountain settlement in the Polish-Czech borderland in Lower Silesia, actually quite close to here. She is charismatic, eccentric, a passionate astrologist, and a stern vegetarian. One day, her two beloved dogs disappear, and shortly later, her neighbor, a poacher, is found dead. Numerous other men die mysteriously, and all of them were part of a tightly knit rural community. All of them were hunters. Leads suggest that animals may have been involved in the killings, but Doszejka too has been suspiciously close to the victims. Absolutely crucial for the movie is that the action is located in a particular landscape in Lower Silesia. I will show you pictures. This is one still from the movie, a beautiful landscape that is shown in various seasons organically following the course of the year, albeit with permanent reference to the hunting calendar. Long takes show the soft rolling hills that are home of a wealth of creatures. The most powerful artistic convention Holland draws upon in her picture is the idyll, eidolon, the Greek for small picture. It is a small world characterized by reduced complexity in which man and animal live in prosperity and harmony. And I will show you a little part of the film in order to convince you that we are dealing with note the twittering birds and so on. Is it loud enough? Don't hear anything, right? Neither do I. Well, enjoy the pictures then. Okay. But the peaceful landscape is under threat. There are hunters hunting the animals, and this I could also show you. I hope that this time the sound works, because this is really crucial. Okay, so we have this contrast of an idyll and hunters, and also the enchantment of the natural environment stands in stark contrast with the cruel, corrupt, and bigoted social order among the populace. The social situation is that of a patriarchy controlled by a local mafia that exploits women and nature alike. So where and how does this landscape appear to be post-socialist? This is first and foremost the economic and social situation, poverty, and also a lack of infrastructure. You can see this on this still here. Oh, shooting again, sorry. Here you see you see a still that is taken from a scene that takes place in the town closest to Doszejko's home, and we see the town in post-socialist decay. And here you can see the post and post-socialist visualized in a way. The trash bins are designed for sorting garbage on the right-hand side, whereas the shop is still old style. Nonetheless, the town is part of a surveillance society. Every corner is video monitored. And this also plays an important role in the action of the film. Earlier I mentioned that landscape and nature are of eminent significance for the movie. This is related to Holland's criticism of the human-animal divide. This happens on the level of biological discourse. For this, Dušejko's relationship with the Czech entomologist Boris Schneider is of particular importance. As he explains to her, both humans and animals are guided by hormones and pheromones and can thus be manipulated biochemically and don't have a free will. Boris and Dušejko embrace this. I will need it. I will need it again. I can put it back, I think. So. Boris and Dušejko embrace this physiological approach to behavior, which becomes clear in a sixth scene that I'm going to show you. Don't worry, it's harmless. And part 2, but I will need the sound. There you go. Slavophilia in a literal sense. Czech man and a Polish woman. They are sniffing on each other. You probably can't really see. This is the pheromones in action. Still too dark. Okay. The two protagonists even discuss the philosophical implications of this, of the fact that people and animals alike are driven by hormones, and they say that free will is an illusion because people smell unconsciously and act accordingly. The film is also deeply critical of the Catholic Church's teaching on humans and animals. We can observe this in the following scene, but it's too bad because, of course, they talk about it, and I'm not sure. I'll try. Here you can see that Dušejko as well as the director Agnieszka Holland are estranged from the church's position that is, and this estrangement is expressed by showing the mouth of the priest in close up in an unusual perspective that makes you perceive your own perception and thus indicates that there's might be something wrong or problematic about this statement. Moreover, Spur raises a polemic about the legal position of animals in Poland. People ask, for instance, why is murder only a crime when people are killed and does not apply to animals? And this also is taken further and relating to the Holocaust. Boris Schneider, the Czech entomologist, applies the term to the extinction of bugs, which is of course problematic. Spur also is a picture very much interested in inverting perspectives in human-animal relations. This becomes clear in a scene that I will show you next. Perhaps. Well, this is probably would even work without sound. The next one. Okay. Does it start? It's always complicated with film scripts. There should be movement there. Oh yeah. well, first you saw the remnants of a body on the ground, and then the deer, and now the deer looks at another dead animal. So the camera imitates the process of observation. Landscape in this movie is not pure nature, but it is constructed by social processes. And in this respect, the proximity of the Czech border is particularly important. Holland shows that the border is permeable for people and animals. Importantly, there is a mutual understanding across national borders. Dušejko and Boris Schneider share cultural values, and they are attached to a certain set of late socialist subculture. The German past in the area is present in the character of Świętopeł Kwierzczyński. His given name, as you might have noticed, is almost impossible to pronounce for Germans. His father was a concentration camp survivor, and he gave the name to his son in order to punish his German wife so that she couldn't pronounce her son's name. He had married her out of hatred to take revenge for the Nazi crimes, and she had hung herself because of her unbearable situation. Thus, Holland finds a way to address the German crimes that are inscribed in this particular territory while avoiding very easy victim-perpetrator schemes. The film also has a utopian dimension. By locating the struggle against animal abuse and cruel patriarchy in a secluded borderland setting, Holland constructs a narrative of continuity from late socialist subculture to a specific European transnational future. Dušejko is representative of a certain social milieu in late socialist societies. Even though she is a trained engineer and has materialist convictions, she nonetheless has hippie sympathies and is esoterically inclined. She is a mother figure of sorts. This can be seen in this picture. Here. Particularly connected to Earth. But her most striking belief system is astrology. Dušejko thinks that people are determined by the stars. She says at one point, how can one be so stupid not to believe in the powers of masses as big as stars, but instead believe in the power of something as small as genes, she says. After hormones, this is the second strike against the rationalist conception of man being a self-determined subject with a free will. But Dušejko's belief in astrology also suspiciously relates to the murders that happen around her. Holland develops what could be called the film's utopian dimension. The trio of Dušejko, Schneider and Kwierzczyński together with the youth form the kernel of a resistance movement against untamed capitalism, discrimination and animal abuse, and patriarchal exploitation. Having bombed and burned their way out of the Polish mountain settlement when Dušejko's murders became all too obvious, the group embarks in a new life. The utopia of a different society is particularly palpable in the movie's final scene, which I will now show you. Again, I will need the sound, but it's already, no, you have it there? Yeah. Please note, we have a classical idyll with bees and everything and destabilized gender roles. The film takes off into utopia in the very end when Dušejko takes her two dogs for a walk that were considered dead, and the deer around them are no longer shy. The landscape is warm and embraces animals and people alike. It's almost like in paradise where lion and sheep lay down next to each other. Can you put it a little bit louder? There's music there. Imagine music. You don't want that. And you can see her taking off into utopia, literally, like with a drone and lifting her up to the level of the trees. And now you see like the dream part of it, where the dogs are alive again. Okay. It's a shame about music. It doesn't really work as well as it does with. So now aesthetically, one is inclined to completely buy into Dušejko's position, but there is, of course, ethical ambivalence because her paradise comes at the price of the killing of humans. Dušejko, as it turned out, committed 3 of the murders. Nonetheless, Dušejko and her friends, eco-terrorists and resistance fighters, if one will, are clearly the characters that the viewer is invited to identify with. Their crimes are downplayed and employed rather as elements of action and suspense in the movie. Therefore, I think that it is legitimate to interpret Holland's Spoor as a specific subcultural adaptation of Slavophile romantic concepts for European liberal ecologic utopia. And in this utopian dimension, I see the main difference to the novel that the film is based on. It is Olga Tokarczuk's Pull Your Plow Through the Dead's Bones. And this is mainly due to different employment of narrative perspective. The novel is a first-person narration, and so that the only perspective that the reader perceives belongs to Janina Dušejko. And at an early stage of the novel, Dušejko's narrative raises the reader's suspicion against her. She has a mysterious neurological disorder, and this disorder temporarily coincides with the murders that happen. So and she also writes crazy letters to the police. So this helps to build up a distance between the reader and the narrator protagonist. The reader is therefore ready to consider this elderly lady not quite as harmless as she seems at first glance. Therefore, the book is also less utopian and more cross-grained than the film. But surely overall it's a very felicitous adaptation. Yet another important intertext of Holland's film is the Coen brothers' 2007 No Country for Old Men. I chose a couple of stills from both movies in order to convince you of the visual similarities between the two movies. Can I get the next slide? Yeah, yeah. There you go. This is the opening scene of No Country for Old Men. So apparently it's also something that has to do with hunting. And now the next one. Can you click once more? Okay, cowboy boots. The first ones are from the Coens movie, and now we see the Holland movie. Cowboy boots as a sign of untamed capitalism in her case. And the third topic is trucks. Trucks in natural environment. So this is Tokarczuk. And did you see the other ones? Yeah, this is the Mexican thing, and here is Holland. So quite similar, I guess. But there's also much deeper dialogue between the two works. The Coen films tells the story of Sheriff Ed Tom, who is about to retire and does not understand the cruelty of the modern world anymore. The killer he chases uses a gas pressure-powered stud gun and slaughters people like animals. Importantly, the action unfolds in a heavily conventionalized landscape, the Texan-Mexican borderland. And I have this picture from the movie, and yet another one here. These images of the land almost inescapably evoke associations. Perhaps I can pull this out now. Associations with the genre of the Western, in which the border is often ascribed a key role. Whereas the classic Western tells stories about villains and those who bring them to justice, No Country for Old Men shows us a world in which the traditional mechanism of law enforcement cease to function, as they do in Holland's Spoor, albeit in a very different way. More importantly, Holland inverts the gender constellations which the Coens film is based upon. the cones show a country in which old men cannot orientate, meaning that it is generally impossible for normal people to come to terms with the new world. Holland, by juxtaposition, depicts a country, Poland, that is, at least in its present state, a country for old men exclusively. This implies that old men's well-being may come at the price of the suffering of women and animals. Lushenko's murders, then, might be just as incomprehensible for the male-dominated society of rural and Lower Silesia as are Chigo's deeds for Sheriff Ed Tom. But Agnieszka Holland shows them as ethically at least tolerable. Summing up, Holland embeds her murder story in Spoor in a far less conventionalized landscape and pictures the utopia of a border-crossing society that overcomes traditional gender roles and the evils of a post-socialist, male-dominated, corrupt society. Thank you for your attention and your patience with technical problems.
Where do you see crime and order located, and maybe what does that say about the post-socialist
situation? That is very ambivalent, and the film doesn't give any easy answers to that question, which is good. And it is always on many different levels the film addresses these questions precisely. So in the first place, the crimes and evils of society originate from those who are in power, right? From the police chief is involved, all kinds of oligarchs and local people and local people in power. So those are the ones who make the world bad because they don't allow families to reunite and they torture animals, and there's a strong threat about age discrimination in the novel that I didn't mention. So the situation is such that these are the people who are guilty for the little world's evils. And then we have this counter figure that we are clearly invited to identify with that fight against this injustice, but they employ unethical means. But this is really not foregrounded in the picture. It's more, it has this detective genre affiliation, but it is also a drama. It is also a kind of nature idyll picture. So it has different sides to it. But the bottom line is that a group of somebody who is traumatized and half German, and this elderly lady who is apparently, at least she's not fully accountable. You can tell that there is something going on in her psyche, that she's at least slightly sick. And then we have young people. One young lady that prostitutes herself more or less openly in order to make a living, and and the little child that we saw in the end is her brother or stepbrother that wasn't allowed to live with her, even though the family was absolutely dysfunctional. And we have the computer geek who, by manipulation of the video surveillance camera, manages to get them out of there. So it's losers of the local order that manage to overcome the terrible situation and lead them to the Czech Republic into paradise. It's Agnieszka Holland said it herself. It's a quote. It's not mine. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to ask a question about just a trope that I've noticed in a few contemporary Polish works of literature and film and even television, and it comes out in Jennifer's story a little bit as well, which is this question of wild landscapes at the borderlands that are inhabited by ghosts of history. Because the thing about I'm not quite sure about Idle. I associate Idle with landscapes that are very human, that are crafted by humans, whereas this seems like a slightly wilder landscape that they're in the middle of. You know, it's a forest rather than agricultural land, for example. But to compare it, there's a television series called Vataha, which is about border guards in Bieszczady, on the Ukrainian border in sort of a forested land, and it creates this sort of noir atmosphere of some very similar shots to in this film. So mist, darkness, snow, and that coincides with the border. And there are questions of historical relations, the different sides of that. Even in Olga Tokarczuk's earlier novel, House of Night, House of Day, House of Night, that sort of semi-wild, certainly undeveloped, not very populated borderland, which has been subject to population exchanges. I think about Wojciech Smarzowski's work, and he's very interested in that semi-wild region in that borderland. It was a sort of famous film called Dom Zły, the Dark House in the English title. So I'm giving you a few other connections. I don't have any ready-made thoughts on this, but with the subject of the conference and landscape, it seems very interesting and sort of present in this film. I wonder if you could expand in any way on that question of the landscape, the border, that sense of a dark semi-wildness, lack of population, ghosts of history, etc.
Yeah, thank you very much. Excellent question. I would say that there are different types of natural images in the movie. On the one hand, and clearly dominating is this friendly forest, sunny landscape. It is a forest, yes, and there is even dead bodies in the forest, but still in these lighter parts we do not have an uncanny impression or anything. And then opposed to that we have a winter's landscape with snow and darkness that is also closely connected to the murders that happen there. And here I could find all that you mentioned, the problem that you are facing like a borderline, or that there's something ambivalent about darkness and so on. This is true in this part, but there are different perspectives on nature and landscape implied in the film. First of all, this male society regards the forest as pure economic resource. They go there having fun shooting animals, and this is even more developed in the novel that the film is based on, that you have people who consider nature a pure resource, and they just transform it into something that they can rob whenever they want. So, but this is not in a metaphysically spoken darkness, but this is only new times that make people act cynically or irresponsibly. And the closeness of the border, it actually reappears very frequently in the film and the novel alike, is more in a sense of liberty or liberation. The possibility to cross the border enables the heroine of the book to buy William Blake on the Czech side in a bookstore, for example, or they go there for, like the animals cross the border freely. And so should be people crossing the border freely. So it's more about liberation, and this is also the European aspect that I would see behind it, because the Boris Schneider character, he's absent in the book, by the way. He's only in the movie. He's a Czech. He's the one who takes it to like the level of European scientific discourse and European law and so on, and really opens it up in a positive way.
Yeah, very expensive. Can I get a coffee? Yeah, of course. Yeah. So
Hello, everybody. Hello. We're carrying on with the second part. Second part of our morning section, and we will have 3 papers. The first one will be given by Giovanna Vukcevic. She is mainly on the commodification of what she calls
uncomfortable memory, and this will also be connected to the paper that she is
to give. Landscapes of Memory, Commodifying Heritage and Branding Tourism in Post-Socialist Europe.
Thank you very much. I guess it's better with the mic, right? So I keep it this way. So just briefly, I have to make a short disclaimer. In the paper, I'm looking at landscapes not as a physical, but more as a representational spaces, as Szybczynski framed it. And in terms of memory landscapes, which I will be using a lot, or the landscapes of memory, I refer to, well, I would say this process of social production of localized cultural memory. And that was the definition given by Maus some years ago. But I would say that my idea of memory landscape actually encompasses even more. It encompasses this sort of spatial markers of memory, sets of cultural representations, the place attachment as an important component, and also these social practices of a specific localized memory. So I'm very much interested into the production of urban memory landscapes, or how the memory actually symbolically occupies the space, and especially in terms of post-socialist memory landscapes. So I think that some of my main questions refer to this. I would even argue that it's the changing paradigm for the memory work. It was mentioned briefly yesterday, but we do have this sort of democratization of the memory work, as history is no longer produced only by historians. What we see and the narratives displayed at the sites of memory are produced more and more by private ventures, by civil society groups, by general public. We have more and more participatory practices. So indeed, we can speak in a way about democratization of the memory landscape, but even more about Instagramization and this sort of phenomena of social network treatment of lieux de mémoire. But what I'm mostly interested in is this idea of commodification. And I guess that some of the main ideas that will be mentioned in this presentation refer to how tourism and economics reshape this contested memory landscapes and narratives, and how resilient or vulnerable these urban and memory landscapes of post-socialist cities are when they're faced with commercial forces. So I will not waste a lot of time on this, but I think it is important to acknowledge that the memory landscape as such is always invested in symbolism, that it's in a way a short social framework through which we make sense of the space, but not only of the space, but also of the past, of our identity, of our history. And of course, memory landscapes as such is a political concept, as it is true this sort of landscape that we are legitimizing the contemporary political agendas, that we are displaying certain narrative that fits into the current ideological framework. So it has this strong political component, it has a strong, I would say, identity building component, because landscapes are what is reflected in our national identities in general. And that's why it becomes so interesting when this sort of memory landscape, about which we will talk in this presentation, is contested. It is, and here I borrow partially MacDonald's definition on contested heritage, but I frame contested memory landscapes as lieux de mémoire which do not easily fit into our contemporary self-representation patterns. The landscape which are in a way dissonant, uncomfortable, or controversial. So in this particular moment, what is extremely interesting is what happened in post-socialist years. Of course, in the post-90s, we were witnessing ideological shift, which was not only about changing political, economic, and social structures in Central and Eastern Europe, but also a lot about changing the dominant narrative. So socialism was definitely branded as something bad. And we were witnessing how many memory sites, heritage places were displaced, abandoned, destroyed in the process. However, there was this, I would say, opposite force, which was growing tourist interest in the remains of socialism. So on the one hand, it is possible to argue that post-socialist Central and Eastern Europe did not lack the willingness to actually depart from the socialist past by offering alternative landscapes, alternative memory narratives, which were focusing on nationalistic histories. On the other side, this burdensome, difficult socialist past was, however, a lucrative marketable resource. And then we come to this idea of commodification, which was taking place throughout the last 2 decades, and which is basically a simple process of assigning economic value to to objects and places which were not previously considered in economic terms. And here I talk about memory and commodification of memory. Here, of course, first and foremost of all the commodifications would be touristification. What is even more important is that this attractiveness of commodification is not only about making profit, about making money. It is, in a way, a relief, a possibility to move away from the contested and burdensome. So my argument was basically that in post-socialist year, commodification was used not only as a profit-making tool, but also as a mechanism to depart from the contested past. So it was a very simple way of keeping the structure, but rebranding it through the variety of economic and tourist mechanisms, which would make of the heritage site more an entertaining object than a historical landmark, which would create more the sort of a pret-a-porter heritage, a marketable version of history, than a symbolical, authentic landmark of the past. So what I will present briefly here in the next few minutes are results of the mostly field work, which I was conducting through the last 2 years. However, I tried to benchmark them with some, well, more recent results. Or the first part that you will see basically refers to the ethnographic observations, because when we speak about memory landscapes, I think that ethnography is what we have to do. And the first part refers to the ethnographic observations I conducted 2015 to 2017 at the sites and I would say memory places which are extremely, I would say, illustrative or emblematic in the cities that I'm working with. But also I try to benchmark them with this contemporary institutionally produced narrative. So official brochures, websites, presentations, and so on. And basically see how this commodification works in practice. So the first is the House of People in Bucharest, and why I consider this to be a part of the contested memory landscapes of Bucharest. Well, basically because up until nowadays it remains one of the most controversial buildings in I would say Central and Southeastern Europe. The construction of the building, which is the second biggest administrative building in the world, second only to Pentagon, it's absolutely colossal. For the construction of the building, actually, 3 historic districts, 28 churches and synagogues were destroyed, and 57,000 families displaced. These are the official data. And in general, in the history of socialism, we can talk about it is recognized as a moment of suffering for the Romanian population, as over 1 million Romanians were actually participating in the construction, and most of them working for free. So it's a symbol of a very oppressive dictatorial regime and late socialism in Romania, which is why just after the death of Ceausescu, there was the first and foremost idea to destroy the building, because it's a site of difficult memory. So the first idea was to destroy the building. However, for the at the time already impoverished Romanian people at the early 90s, it was way too costly. The cost of the construction of the building will colossal, and the cost of the destruction would be as important, which is why then there was this another idea to turn it into the world's largest casino. But there were also some other idea to work with it as a museum of communism and so on. What happened already in '93, if I'm not wrong, is that in '94, the management of the biggest part of the building was actually, I would say, externalized by the state. So management of the building and of the official narrative, official uses of the building, other than the siege of national Romanian parliament, are actually given to the International Conference Center, which is actually just a very fancy name for the public-private venture which was created by the government to take care of the building. So what happened is, when you open the website, you can see this marvelous picture of this stunning palace, and an opening quote, "A masterpiece of Romanians," by the Secretary General, former Secretary General of Council of Europe. However, what you understand later is that basically half of that was lost in translation. That the full quote is, "The palace of a megalomaniac man, but also a masterpiece of the Romanians." So I think it's really interesting to see how we choose what part we are going to display and how the official discourse is going to. And what you can also see, and what I think is extremely interesting, is this opulence of luxurious pictures showing wonderful ceremonial halls that you can actually rent, where you can organize your birthday parties, weddings, where you can organize your receptions and huge summits and conferences. So if next time you are searching for a nice venue, I think we would be good here too. What is even more important is this discursive shift from the palace as a symbol of communism to the palace advertised nowadays on the website as a symbol of democracy. So I think it's really interesting to actually see how these, I would say, reshaping and reframing of memory works in practice. And this goes very well in line with which you don't see here, but was basically some of the pictures. I think the first one, yeah, this one, I made it in 2015. In summer 2015, I visited the building. I did this, I participated in this guided tour. It was about 15 of us, and I think the official number is 208,511 tourists in 2017. So it's a huge number. The admission fee was at that time around €8. I'm not sure about now. And basically, you're entitled to a guided tour with the official guide, who during over 1 hour of the tour of the palace, which I did at the time, only mentioned communism in Romania and Ceausescu once at the very beginning. So other than that, for the next hour, she focused on contemporary uses of the building, on the architectural splendor, on Romanian craftsmanship as a building, as a symbol of this wonderful marble brought from different parts of Romania, and the wood, and this wonderful carpets done by Romanian masters. And it was extremely interesting to see that even when some of the tourists participating in the guided tour, myself included, tried to ask her about, well, socialism in Romania, about how Romanians are nowadays interacting with the building, she was probably instructed not to engage in that sort of conversation. So she would just like briefly answer, and she made it very clear that the building is not about that. It's not about Ceausescu. It's not about socialism. The building is about this exceptional Romanian craftsmanship and capacity to build such extraordinary structures. So what was interesting, however, is to note that throughout, when I was preparing for this presentation, during this summer, I was trying to browse through the website and get the official brochures because I was not able to visit Bucharest again. But I think that would be interesting too, to see if the discourse changed. Because what changed is that nowadays on the website and in the brochure, unlike 3 years ago, we have much more information on the socialism in Romania. So there's a whole section dedicated to to communism in Bucharest, to communist Bucharest, and so on. There is a whole section dedicated to Ceausescu and anecdotes related to his, well, uncommon relationship with the chief architect, Anca Petrescu, and this practice of him and his wife Elena just coming out of the blue to check how the construction works go, and so on and so on. So there is a lot of fun trivia, there is a lot of anecdotes, but there is also a lot about difficult socialist history and difficult story of the building, which is nowadays displayed on the website. So my question was if we might understand this in two manners, so that at some point, commodification was a necessary tool to purge the building from its uncomfortable potential. So to change the meaning of the building by, well, renting it through this important events, or by selling tourists the tickets to enter what is now a temple of democracy, a symbol of democracy for the Romanians. But what we might see gradually is that as time passes by, it becomes possible to speak of this. Yeah, I'm closing on. Thank you. It becomes actually possible to discuss this historical, to become more historical and to discuss these stories once again. So the question is whether this is a market-driven process. So are the uncomfortable histories what tourists actually seem to be most interested in, and is that the reason behind this renewal, or this process of going back to more historical building, and not only this luxury, opulent venue for posh events? Or we might argue that commodification actually enables us to engage with the past, only if at first it seems to be in a very superficial, very disengaged, very entertaining and commercial way. As the time passes by, perhaps it becomes more and more easy to actually engage with this sort of memory structures and memory landscapes as in a more critical way. To acknowledge the building, to make sense of it, I will of course skip my second example, although I would love to discuss it, but perhaps some next time. So I think that in conclusion, I would just like to, well, rather than conclusion, just throw a set of questions about if we might argue that with this sort of post-socialist memory landscapes, the physical features of the landscapes are actually showing a great resilience, but what is fluctuating is the narrative. And the question would be if tourism and commerce are decontextualizing this sort of socialist memory landscapes and removing and rebranding the socialist symbols, transforming the historical authenticity and objectivity of these sites. Could we understand commodification as a starting point for accepting uncomfortable legacies and contested landscapes? In this process of stripping off and historically detaching symbolically charged spaces, we are perhaps actually arriving to the point where we might address them not only as entertaining and commercial, but also as historical, and actually be able to come to terms with the past. My final question would be if, when we speak about commodification in this particular sense, we talk about commodification of memory landscapes or the luxury landscapes, because in both examples I was addressing in my paper, there is this notion of luxury and opulence and memory and luxury, which I think would be extremely interesting. And I will finish here because I'm already 3 minutes behind the schedule. Thank you very much, and if there are any questions.
Thank you, Giovanna. Thank you. And we will directly carry on with our next speaker, Jakub Gawkowski. He studied history in Poland and is now a PhD student at Central European University. Am I? Oh, okay, sorry. I misunderstood that from your CV. Nonetheless, he will be speaking about the concentration camp Lublin between the liberation and the musealization of the laboratory of propaganda, memory, and exhibition making in the early post-war years.
So I will speak very briefly about the first period of the museum in Majdanek. Can I have the? So, regardless what date we'll consider as the end of the Second World War, the first museum established to commemorate its victims was established when the war was still ongoing. The concentration camp Kal Lublin on the outskirts of Lublin was liberated by the Soviet army on the 23rd of July 1944, and shortly after became the Memorial Museum. In this paper, I will focus on the first period of the activity of the museum and the first exhibition organized by the institution, both in the camp and outside of it. The Majdanek Museum, I think, is an interesting case from at least two perspectives: as a public institution operating in the first months and years of the liberated Poland, and as a first museum in the world to commemorate and document atrocities of the war. As Jan C. Berendt notes, already in 1944, some features of Sovietization became visible, and Lublin became a place of an early attempt to create socialist Poland and the laboratory of propaganda state in Statun Szczędy. However, the example of Majdanek delivers a more complex picture. The museum established in Lublin, which was the first place of coexistence Polish, Soviet, and Jewish narratives in post-war Poland, can be seen also as a laboratory of memory. As I shall manifest, Majdanek, in its first years, can be perceived as an experimental institution, which was the first in the world to be dealing with the tragic history of past years, and therefore touched upon a problem reaching far beyond the labels of Sovietization. After the Red Army liberated Majdanek, a special investigative commission was established in order to document, research, and later accuse the perpetrators. At first, the commission did not include any Poles, but soon it became more inclusive, and Andrzej Witos became its first leader. And what's important is that Andrzej Witos was actually an art historian. Despite the fixed date of the museum creation, the borders dividing the history of the museum and the history of the concentration camps are somehow blurry. The institution was established in 1944, but the essence of the museum had already been inscribed earlier by cataloging and segregating not items, but humans. According to Wolfgang Ernst, and he was actually writing about Auschwitz, but I think we can as well apply it to this case. In the concentration camps, the normally supplementary process of musealization was performed in real time, when the dead bodies were searched for hidden valuables, golden teeth, and women's hair. What the liberating Allied armies, in this case Soviet army, were confronted with when entering these camps was heaps of such objects in the storerooms. Even before the museum was established, Majdanek became a recognized spot by the society as a place of a tragic historical value. Crowds spontaneously visited the camp, which we can see on the photography here. And although mostly in ruins without any infrastructure left, the site evoked emotional reactions and became a place of grieving. From the moment of liberation, the hybrid status of the place was constructed. After 1944, Majdanek had to serve multiple functions, being museum, cataloging and exhibiting items, a cemetery, and a place of commemoration, but also it was a cultivated field, army barracks, and a simple stock of resources. Up until 1946, the site of the former camp was also the place of stationing of the Polish and Soviet military who were using and exploiting Majdanek infrastructure, which by the time was already recognized as a historical proof and something that demanded special protection. In October 1944, Andrzej Witos outlined the general route through the camp and the aims of the main exhibition. But the camp had to wait for another year to be open for visitors. Since the beginning, the museum served a clear political purpose. During the interview in September 1945, Andrzej Wito stated that the camp will be preserved as a museum commemorating human suffering, and it will become a visible proof of crimes committed by Germans on Poles, Soviet prisoners, and Jews. And here already you can see some kind of hierarchy in this sentence. The support of the authorities for the institution came namely from the fact that they had noticed the potential of Majdanek for anti-German communist propaganda. The camp also became an important part in forming the attitudes of soldiers who were sent from the east to the Western Front, as most of the supports went through Lublin, and the soldiers were considered the first audience of the museum. In January 45, one of the museum employees wrote, "While we observe the impressions of the troops of Polish army and the Red Army and listen to their comments on German atrocities, we must state that Majdanek makes unforgettable experience and it can trigger a sense of patriotism and enthusiasm for fighting with the German occupant." The first exhibition organized by the museum, and therefore perhaps the first exhibition regarding the Nazi concentration camp ever created, took place between 26th of November and the 2nd December 1944. Majdanek in visual arts, Majdanek w plastyce, was organized outside the camp in the museum in Lublin and presented the works of Zinovy Tokachev. Tokachev was a Soviet Jewish artist and soldier, and there is, I think, a common misconception that he was a soldier who happened to draw also on the spot. But in fact, he was already, by the time he was enlisted in the Soviet army in 1941, he was already a recognized artist. So he was more of an artist than a soldier actually. And you can see the pages from the catalog accompanying the exhibition behind me. Parallel to the exhibition, the trial of 6 of camp former staff members was taking place in the camp. So their sentences were executed inside on the 3rd of December 1944. So in the same time, this is the site of an execution and also a site of creating a visual narrative. The Tokachev exhibitions were accompanied by the catalog opening with a guide from Joseph Stalin, who called to let the butchers know that they will not escape responsibility for their crimes. And of course, now we see the absurdity of opening this catalog with a statement from Stalin, but also the introduction. We can read about the aim of the museum is to reconstruct the life of camp's prisoners, securing and protection of all reminders, so they can provide and make visible the 5 years of the reign of German beasts and struggle of European nations. So the emphasis of European and not only on Poles is something that is worth looking at. For the first months of its existence, the ambitions of the museum and role ascribed to it by the authorities were huge and reached far beyond the former camp. So following Tokachev exhibition, the museum organized the presentation of photographs and official documents, which attracted 25,000 visitors. And later, this exhibition also traveled to places like Kraków, Łódź, Katowice, and Rzeszów. After the brief moment of being in the center of post-war memory politics, Majdanek was gradually overshadowed by Auschwitz, and in 1947 already it was Auschwitz that became the leading place, and I will not discuss the reasons behind it, but maybe we can talk about it later. Coming back to the museum, the struggle to organize the exhibition and maintain the museum was coming from the constant need to renegotiate the space, as well the objects that were inside, with authorities and the military. Although the institution was granted official support, the status of the military was of a higher importance, of course. Initially, the troops made only few barracks available for the exhibition, which was by no means sufficient for the proper display. Finally, the barrack number 62, the former shoemaker's workshop, was available, and the first permanent exhibition opened officially in September 1945 during the week of Majdanek. And the week of Majdanek was, of course, an official Polish celebration with a very strong Catholic theme also. When the permanent exhibition was opened in few rooms in one of the barracks, it contained of statistics, photographs, drawings, items from the daily life on inmates and their belongings. Photographs of the camp from the moments after liberation were displayed next to Tokachev's artworks. The dominant element of the exhibition space were the Cyclone B canisters, on which mannequins, wax figures, dressed as the people from the camp were staying. I think this is, you can see it best. Andoniferski wrote earlier, he wanted to present different layers of camp and the long way of the prisoners. Exercises, how they had to work, but and finally their death. The effect of disgust and fear was additionally strengthened by placing the mannequins next to the human remains. The scientific part of the exhibition was based on the findings of the Polish-Soviet Commission. And 2 million, here you can see on a picture that actually 2 million murdered people from all over the world. This gigantic number of Majdanek's victims in 1945 had an impact of ascribing, again, a great importance to the place, but was not actually based on any sufficient research. Later on, through the years, different scholars gave wide range of numbers, 360,000 in 48, 250,000 in 75, and finally 78,000 in 2005. Polish nationality of the majority of the victims was emphasized on a very possible part of the exhibition. For example, the little container with ashes was placed on a pedestal covered in Polish flag that you can see here on the side. Other nationalities were acknowledged, but they served only as a background for Polish martyrdom. Emphasizing the Polishness of the victims of Majdanek was part of the national strategy of communists who cultivated the national divisions in order to get the support of the Polish society. However, in the case of Majdanek Memorial, the need for the patriotic narrative was both imposed from above and coming from below, as it emerged from the result of the collective experience of Polish citizens of Lublin who wanted to commemorate their own and their family members' suffering. On one hand, there is this strong emphasis of Poles, but on the other, the government commission in 45 already commissioned the plan for opening 22 national pavilions, and the keys were already distributed during the week of Majdanek. But the only pavilion that was open was the Jewish pavilion, prepared by the Central Committee of Polish Jews that you can see here. And so this is again the beginning of this format that you have exhibition and then the national pavilion, so something that we can see in Auschwitz, for example, still today, and also what is a bit grim, that this is the same format that you would find in art fairs and in this world exhibitions all over the world before. Right after the exhibition was opened, the press started to publish critical reactions. The dissatisfaction with the display was the result of the difficulty of representing the camp life. One of the journalists wrote about his visit in Majdanek and how the display, namely due to the wax figures that we still see there, instead of compassion evoked horror and disgust. The figures disappeared from the exhibition, and displaying victims' belonging in modest, silent manner became a universal method for a museum to deal with the genocide. Similar reactions had an impact on planning not only further exhibitions in Majdanek, but also later in Auschwitz, the exhibition which opened in 1947. And so today, according to Paul Williams, for example, former prisons converted into memorial museums, I quote, generally refuse to the drama of reenactment, instead focusing on the contextual information. Therefore, we can point out that it was the case of Majdanek that shaped the European history of exhibition making in this extent, and the canon of commemorating the atrocities in the museum. As Krzysztof Banach, historian working with Majdanek, points out, never before other institutions had faced similar tasks, and that Majdanek, of course, it had no prototype and no other historical institution to get inspiration from. And also, this is important to mention that most of the museums established in 1945 and 1946, already museum workers would reflect on the fact of this challenge and how new it was. As every museum, the institution existed on several levels: as a space, architecture, displayed objects, and finally as a platform of collective memory. Mika Ball suggests that the position of the museum objects embodies the discourse of memorial representation that both affirms and informs. By informing the viewer of the significance of the object, the museum display also affirms its significance. Becoming a museum object is becoming collected and thus being valued and remembered institutionally. Exhibition making is in fact the signifying process through which the museum endow object with meaning. Therefore, the history of the first exhibition in Majdanek is a remarkable moment when belongings of victims and Zyklon B canisters are turned into museum display and remembered for the first time. The documents from the first period of the activity of the museum provide an insight into the complex signifying process in which institutional remembrance is a result of several external factors. Some of the elements of the camps were incorporated into the exhibition narrative and became symbols of the genocide. Others, as furniture, clothes, or wooden barracks, were recognized as useful supplies by different groups and reused. And here just a brief example on these two documents. On the left, you can see the letter from the Polish radio, actually asking for the furniture from Majdanek to be lent to the institution, as they were in need of furnishing their offices. And on the other hand, on the other side, there is a report from institutional activity in 1946, which, among other, contains information about the vegetables that were growing on the spot, and for example, 5,000 potatoes that were there in 1946, and I guess this is again kind of counterintuitive, because usually we would think about this soil and this landscape as we can say about it as something intoxicated, something very dark, something deadly, and in this case, this land was also basically feeding the community that was using it. And to conclude, this is of course a very brief summary of the discussed period. The institutional history of the museum can shed a light into daily existence in Lublin after the liberation, but it can also be interpreted as a metaphor for the ways in which collective memory operates. The collective memory is formed by the memory of individuals, but depends on the changing context of the community or society. And the sites of memory, like Majdanek, are largely constructed and performed, and they artificially organize the past and create the meanings. The historical exhibition, as we experience here, is a place where individual and collective, subjective and objective, or as we can say, scientific, collide. Majdanek, as in any other historical exhibition, was a battlefield of control of interpretation and purchasing power. By collecting, inventorying, storing, processing, and displaying, the museum produced the knowledge extending far beyond the museum walls. Thank you.
Thank you, Jakub, for this presentation. And we will directly pass on the microphone. Will you switch places? And I will announce the next speaker. This is Stefanie Weismann, who is a postdoc from Vienna University. She gained her PhD in the Galicia Colleague in Vienna with a thesis about Zachar Masoch. And now she works on a history of smells in Lublin, which sounds fascinating to me. And she will be speaking about Lublin of the future, clean, hygienic, orderly, reshaping the former Jewish Podzamcze area after World War II. Okay.
Thank you for the introduction. So in the Lublin case study, the second Lublin case study I'm introducing today, I will look at urban landscape as sensory landscape. So in particular, I'm inquiring into the sensory sentiments and discourse evolving around Lublin's Jewish neighborhood, Podzamcze. So you see the castle, the zamek, and the buildings around which was surrounded by Podzamcze, which was the main Jewish district. And the castle will also serve as a point of orientation for other slides and pictures I will show afterwards. The idea comes from my current project on the smellscapes of East Central Europe, where I try to, so to say, literally sniff out history, asking how we can narrate the 20th century in the region by its smells. That is especially how smells responded to changing political, economic and social orders. And of course this sensory history approach is not solely about the smells themselves, but what meanings and associations people imputed on smells. So in the context of some kind of olfactory urban history of the city of Lublin, I'm asking which smells affected Lublin citizens, their everyday life, and how these smells reflect cultural and political transformations, and what do certain smell perceptions tell us about socio-political sentiments and inter-ethnic sensitivities. Today it is not only about smells. I adapted it a little bit to the topic of the conference, but it's about the smell, filth and cleansing rhetoric that evolved around the neighborhood Podzamcze until after World War II. Jewish Podzamcze, you can, where is this light thing? I'm always afraid to use it. But you see the plan here with the black, the map here with the black, the castle marked black, and the surrounding area is Podzamcze, and you see a picture of the castle again and the surrounding Podzamcze. The old town would be somewhere here. Jewish Podzamcze had long since been reported to be a dirty, a smelly, a crowded place of bugs, of epidemics and poverty. And besides, of course, being a poor neighborhood, it also had poor infrastructure. There is no sewage system, like also the rest of Lublin before the war. And additionally, a very unfortunate topography in the lowlands of the city, close to a highly polluted river, you can see here. And on very damp and swampy ground, which was regularly flooded. Thus, the sources about pre-war Podzamcze, and I'm working both with EGO documents, archival documents of the public health department mainly, with local press reports. And so all the sources, no matter if they're Polish or Yiddish, mostly address Podzamcze's dilapidated houses, the lack of sunlight, its catastrophic hygienic conditions, its rachitic children, and last but not least, its enormous stench. So it was a very emotionalized topography because of its sensorial density. And of course, stench and filth are always terms that ascribe some kind of authority to a threatening thing or person or community or to a neighborhood. And phenomenon of olfactory othering is very common when it comes to everyone different, and in this case to Jewish co-citizens or the neighborhood. So in consequence, in the case of Podzamcze, we have a continuity of different authorities aiming at cleaning up the neighborhood, both materially as well as morally. So the neighborhood regularly experienced forced upon delousing and disinfection actions by the city authorities. And the filth and vermin of pre-war Podzamcze was also frequently equated with moral squalor, with ethnic impurity, a rhetoric that of course increased under Nazi occupation, but existed long before. So just shortly about the history of the neighborhood. Since 1942, the main part of this Podzamcze area served as a Jewish ghetto under occupation, and of course the traditional filth and disease discourse was enhanced by the notion of racial filth and pollution. In 1943, the ghetto was dissolved, and the area of Podzamcze got heavily demolished in the following years. So you see the castle again. So it was partly destroyed by looting and violence during the dissolution of the ghetto, partly also in the course of final war actions in 1944 when the Red Army was approaching with heavy artillery fire. And similar to other cities across Europe, partly being destroyed during World War II, Lublin, and also in particular demolished Podzamcze, remained a landscape of ruins for several years after the war. And initially I was interested in how this very emotionalized topography and always lively discussed Podzamcze neighborhood was perceived and discussed after the war. So what were the reactions on this previously very dense and now completely emptied neighborhood? So a neighborhood where reactions on its crowdedness and the sound of the vernacular, the smell of their cooking, but also the smell of sanitary negligence dominated, and a neighborhood which also rendered a long discourse of orientalization and exoticism, and suddenly this neighborhood stays empty, and it was quite a huge area in ruins. However, Podzamcze was officially addressed again only in 1954. That is 10 years after the war, for the occasion of the 10th anniversary of the liberation of Lublin in 1944, or also the 10th anniversary of the PKWN, of the Polish Committee of National Liberation. So on this occasion, the city was profoundly restructured for the festivities. So the city was hastily engaged into renovation and construction work and was rebuilt within a few months, at least the facades. And this also included the building over or the glossing over of the area of the former Jewish Podzamcze. So in 1954, Podzamcze got cleaned with enormous effort. You can see here still some kind of ruins, although we have seen that there were buildings before, and here already some first part of future construction work of some stairs to the castle. So Podzamcze got cleaned with enormous effort and preciseness. So the ruins taken apart, the rubble removed onto the last cobble, and the main Jewish street, we have seen part of it before Szeroka was erased, as well as all other streets of the neighborhood and everything that had been there. So it is that not one material trace of the neighborhood lived through this cleansing action. So not even the behavior of the original streets. So nothing but the castle on the hill remained on its place. We always have as a background. So what was left was a cleaned up and entirely empty space, so it's ready for a new and totally different beginning. And in 1954, exactly there where previously the main street of Jewish Lublin ran, the authorities now erected a Platz Zebran Ludowich, a square of people's gathering. I don't know how to translate it really. So this would be this part, and here in 1954, they were celebrating Polish People's Republic, staging a new political and urban order. And the, so to say, purgation of Podzamcze after the war was a major symbolic act of creating Lublin of the future. So the contemporary press at that time constantly invokes Lublin, city of the future, and this palimpsest situation, so that new Lublin of the future was somehow literally built on the foundations of its sore past, rendered only few references in the process of renovating the city, but without directly referring to Jewish Lublin and its fate. So we come across some articles on new Lublin opposed to old one, rarely, but still. I quote, "So the new shops and cafeterias of newly built Lublin do not remind us of its old filth," or "Today's Lublin is clean," or Ulica Kowalska, which was also former mainly Jewish inhabited street, is, I quote, "an old street which comes in a new outfit, it turned from filthy to bright. So, and also strikingly dominating the headlines of the local newspapers is the big cleaning up, which so Czechenia is a very, very dominant word in press at the time, which reminds us of the partly violent sanitizing efforts of the neighborhood since the 19th century. So there is some kind of continuity of cleaning the city from Jewish filth, starting with disinfecting measures of the Russian authorities, up to the slogans of the National Democrats in interwar Lublin, which were very much interested in cleaning Polish space and Polish air from foreign smells, up to the ethnic cleansing during World War II, until the dismantling of the whole neighborhood by communist authorities. So we have slogans in the press like Operation Establishing Order, like Akcja Porządkowa, or cleaning up the surroundings of the castle. And these frequent headlines of Operation Establishing Order somehow awkwardly remind us of the preceding cleansing activities, like, I don't know, Operation Reinhardt, and it somehow might sound provocative, but purging the Jewish neighbors and cleaning the neighborhood from its inhabitants by Nazi occupants was somehow literally paving way, as it were, for socialist Lublin of the future. So we can see it here that where not long ago a mixed crowd of vendors or artisans and children was dominating the streets, now we have a collective body of workers or volunteers erecting Lublin of the future. And Lublin of the future also meant, I quote from press at that time, instead of the remains of chaotic building, new stylish housing blocks are fringing the place. And in fact, the first workers' estate, so Osiedle Robotnicze in Lublin, was built at around the Plac Zebran Ludowich. And of course, instead of the vibrant Jewish business street Szeroko, we have now the public square of communist representation. This is a picture of Bird's perspective today, or more or less today. So you see the workers' estate surrounding the square. So to conclude, post-World War II, Lublin was dominated by a public discourse on literally cleaning up with the past to establish Lublin of the future, especially regarding the Jewish neighborhood Podzamcze. And this sanitation and cleansing discourse can look at back at a long tradition. So the wording of hygiene, of establishing order, maintaining cleanliness, dominates Lublin's pre-war discussion of smelly and filthy Podzamcze, but this attitude was continued and executed during Nazi occupation and its cleansing actions. However, it also reflects Polish post-war attitude towards its sore past. So the constructional as well as discursive cleansing of Lublin's Jewish topography can thus be read as a part of a long since established sanitation and deodorization project aimed at this neighborhood, and perhaps also as at a Polish city as such. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. So now we have a little more than 15 minutes for discussion. The floor is open for questions. You probably need a microphone.
Thank you all for really interesting presentations. And I have a very simple question to Joanna. And thank you very much. I liked really this concept of uncomfortable memory being commodified, but just I'm thinking, isn't communism itself like a commodity, and a commodity not because of uncomfortability of memory, but maybe because of global fashion much more. And just a case that I know a small group of not such a small actually of young anarchists in the university where I teach, and all of them, absolutely all of them really, have been visiting Bucharest at least once or more times, and staying there longer or shorter. And it's just a question of honor. And why to go to Bucharest because of memory of communism from Lithuania, you know? It's a nonsense, because just stay at home and enjoy. And but it's a global fashion. And so my question is about the relationship between the uncomfortability of memory, or between alternative, maybe, I don't know, attitudes to memory, and commodification. What do you think? I think that you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's interesting to notice that there are still that sort of alternative groups doing their own counter memory, and I definitely very much agree that this sort of commoditization of memory and of communism has a lot to do with all these sorts of retro trends, popularity of vintage, nostalgia. Like, there is a number of phenomena which I think are really deeply involved into creation of this sort of practices. However, what used to be argued by a number of scholars was that this sort of counter memorials and this sort of counter alternative memory practices were especially important in the immediate post-89, right? Simply because people wanted to acknowledge their own memories. So it was, in a way, a rebellion against this official discourse, which was wiping out all the positive memory of communism. So it was, in a way, an attempt to legitimize one's own past and one's own memory, and to say, but I still want to remember this sort of thing. So I think that in the first part, in the very first post-socialist years, this hype for everything socialist was partially due to this idea that there was this need to acknowledge and to ascertain the past, which was officially pretty much dissolved or erased from the official discourses. Nowadays, I think it has a lot of more to do with the quest for authenticity. So I think that there is this seductive potential of communism as something which is still unexplored. So I'm not sure if we can also speak about seductive potential of uncomfortable or difficult, but I think there is also a possibility to reflect on it, and it would be interesting actually to see what degree of uncomfortability is also acceptable. Because when another example I was working with was this former concentration camp island in southern Montenegro, which has been turned into a luxury 5-star hotel resort. So for me, there is always a degree of uncomfortability, because we definitely speak about uncomfortable memory landscape in this particular case. Right, it was a former concentration camp. But you are able to commodify that sort of place because, it's not as uncomfortable as Auschwitz or as a big memorial site. So I think also it's extremely interesting to reflect on this, which degree of uncomfortability we're ready to cope with, and what can be commodified and what cannot. And I think it has a lot to do also with international relevance, entanglement of politics and economics in the society, and so on. Thank you.
Any more questions? Oh, okay. I didn't see you. Sorry.
So I've got two questions to Jovana and to Jakub. And perhaps I would start from Jakub, since Giovanna already got a bit of the floor. So Jakub, I would like, that was very inspiring what you showed. I mean, the stream of the thinking I saw in your text when you mentioned that the first director was art historian, and the first event organized at the was actually an artist presentation. So I thought then about another endeavor of Majdanek Museum that started in the 80s. They started this series of triennales, artistic triennales, and actually this is something for me extremely interesting to discuss, because actually no other death site has an art collection. Actually Auschwitz used to have, but they dissolved it, so they don't have anymore except of some extremely precious Picasso style things. So I think I wonder what is your opinion on this, not musealization, but I don't know if there's a right word, art gallerization of a death camp, because it's extremely risky endeavor. And I saw the storehouses of Majdanek, and this is extremely striking when you see artworks, those anti-war artworks, just neighboring the historical objects, like one room to another. So it creates a certain situation that is actually not observable anywhere else. So since you are pursuing this topic, I really wonder, what do you think of that? And Giovanna, I liked very much the contested landscape idea, because I think the contested word is extremely interesting, and I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on that, because if we think about the etymology of the word, even if we don't look into dictionaries, we can hear it right away, contested, so witnessing together, yeah, and this is the root meaning of the word, lost somewhere in 16th century. So the word started to mean denying rather than attesting or testifying, but it used to mean something completely different that we are accustomed to. But if we trust the term, as postmodernists taught us, actually this means that when we use the word contested, something that is contesting is doing two things at once. So this is not the either or first and then the second, but this is like the situation that is simultaneous. So the sides you presented, they deny something, but they testify to something at the same time, not, well, doing one or another thing, like in the conceptual way. So I'm wondering if you gave any thoughts to this like simultaneous faculty of being a witness and denier to some kind of memory.
Thank you for this comment and question. Yeah, I think the case of Majdanek art collections is something very interesting. But I think we should maybe distinguish between the kind of an exhibition I was speaking about, because, for example, these drawings by Tokachev, they were created on the spot, and so then the identity sort of an object is very different, I would say, because it is an artwork, so it is a representation, but in the same time, this is the object that was there. So it is very much as a museum artifact in that very sense. Whereas the pieces that will be created in the triennial in the 80s or later, it is something that it is reflecting on the historical events in an artistic way. So I think that there is this would be the difference. But I think in the case of Majdanek, actually we had with Stephanie, we had this conversation about Lublin and Majdanek in a way being marginalized in this the discussion of memory or concentration camps, because of course, like you have all this attention in Auschwitz, but in Majdanek there is not that much attention, I would say. So maybe this kind of different way of approaching the memory, different way of representing it and contextualizing it and problematizing it with help of artists is something which I think was very brave and you know very very clever idea to do, no, and then something very in the avant-garde of thinking about this memory sites. I don't know if that answer your questions, but yeah.
Just very briefly, thank you very much. I wasn't actually considering the etymological aspect of the word, but amongst number of words which are used mostly in heritage studies, we have this idea of dissonant, uncomfortable, controversial, contested, difficult. So there is a wide array of words which are used to pretty much depict this sort of processes and situation. My choice of the word contested is exactly anchored in what you just named. I think that it reflects very well this dual nature of the process taking place, this dual reality. So that of preserving, but rebranding, that of denying and witnessing at the same time. I believe that's something that, you know, is in the core of my research and of these processes. So that's where my choice of the word contested stems. But it might have as well been the word uncomfortable or difficult. And then it opens a number of other questions, because uncomfortable for whom, or contested for whom? Because it's not uncomfortable or contested for all of the groups. So sometimes it's just one of the groups in the society which actually has an issue with that particular heritage site or object or landscape, or these interpretations which are arising from the process. If that answers the question. Thank you.
Yeah, and Stanley, please. And then Mariusz was next.
I've got a question
Let's
for
see how far-
Stephanie. We're quite interested in projects that are attempting to, or interpretations that reinscribe the Jewish character of the area into the cityscape. In particular, there's a very eccentric book by a very eccentric Lublin professor, Władysław Panas, called Oko Tzaddyka, or the Eye of the Tzaddik. It's just been translated into German, I think. I'm sure you know it, but he essentially finds in the very odd shape of this Platz am Kove a symbol from the Kabbalah, and then he finds this reads numerological significance into the numbering of the houses. Now, he doesn't claim that it's intentional, but it's an interesting sort of metaphysical attempt to sort of read Jewish meanings back into the cityscape. I was wondering if you had any comments on that, or if you paid any attention to this very recent history. And there's, of course, a whole movement gathered around this what's it called? Brama Grodska, is that what it's called? The cultural organization in Lublin that's very interested in rediscovering those main aspects of the city's history.
Thank you. Well, I'm well aware of what's going on around, especially Podzamcze in the whole discussion from Panas to Brama Grodska. But actually, I adapted my speech to the topic of the conference. Actually, my main topic of sensory history is rather everyday life history, so I'm not so much involved in memory work, and to be honest, sometimes, especially in Lublin, I'm sometimes just fed up with all this memory work, so I don't know if I'm in the right panel here. Sorry. And it's also that I'm usually not dealing so much with material landscapes as I presented it today, but much more with, you know, the more fluid landscape of smellscapes. And so I'm familiar with the publications, with the literatures, I'm familiar with the activities going on there, but I know as I'm doing my project about Lublin, it has a part of the project, but I try to not get too much involved in this very, again, emotionalized discussion of this area. Thank you.
I have a short question to you, Stephanie, as well. I wonder, like, if you said about this, you know, clean, hygienic, and you focus on the forms, what about social structure? Have you did any investigations where the kind of proper socialist working class moved there, or was just an occasional? And before you answer, I have one more comment to both of your papers of on the kind of memorization and or memories. There's probably the most memorizing museum of anti-communism or communism in Romania is in Sighet, former prison, and the motto is memory as a form of justice. What I want to say that not every communist building or a museum bring this memory or memorization. Like this palace, as from what you said, Giovanna, this Palace of People of Palace of Parliament, there's not much narrative or not much text about communism. I've been there also, and it was all about, you know, the architecture, practically, and construction. So there was not really a memory of communism in this sense. So not every building built in the communism is this form of justice. Some of them are a house of terror in Budapest, that's for sure. While this Palace of the People, I don't know, is it okay? It's our perspective, that's how we see it, but it's not this kind of memory justice as the Sighet prison, for example, is. Yeah, that's.
Thank you. Just shortly to the socialist work living there. I've done much more research on pre-war Lublin than after-war Lublin, but it is interesting that the first event that took place on this Plac Zebran Ludovich was a Vistava Rolnicza, which is very Polish, a very agricultural region, and it's and there are accounts of peasants coming into the city with their cows and tractors and whatever they expose there, and who probably never have been in Lublin before, and they're just overwhelmed by this new Lublin and this nice square and the workers' estate, and so this was actually what, perhaps the aim of the whole project, that here you see a new socialist city, and the peasants from the surrounding country are the perfect addressees to. Yeah. Well, I don't know if the square as such was successful. So there was the anniversary of the PKWN, and together with the Vistava Rolnicza, but I think the 1st of May festivities rather took place on Krakowskie Przedmieście or something like that. Yeah. But as to the workers' estates, so there were the first osiedle robotnicze and very, but it turned out, and that they offered new, bright, flat apartments for the new worker. But it turned out that they somehow forgot about the sanitary facilities. So somehow the history is repeating itself. So it was apparently not the best place to live, despite.
Can I have a short?
But we have one question from the audience, but if you want to ask a question. You want to raise your hand? Yeah. And this is probably.
Okay, so the question to Joanna, or rather a comment maybe as well, because during your presentation I was thinking about our own architectural monster in Warsaw, that is Palace of Culture, and in the beginning named after or to honor Joseph Stalin. And I remember the debate that we went through in Poland in the early 2000s, maybe, whether to destroy it or not, or whether to recognize it as a monument. And I remember that it was a very political debate also, and you could easily predict who's gonna vote for what. So my question is whether in Romania also it was very clearly connected to the politics, and whether, you know, maybe because nowadays Palace of Culture is recognized as monument, and I'm quite sure that if the politics in Warsaw, municipal politics, were different in those days, it wouldn't be.
Yeah, shortly. No, I totally agree. And I think it's extremely interesting to actually see how through the last, well, 25 or even 30 years, we actually had different monuments and different, I would say, historical narratives acknowledged in different countries and in different periods. So we do not have uniformity, I would say, in Central and Eastern Europe in these terms, but it really stems from the current political framework in which this sort of monuments are recognized or not. So I think for some future studies, it would be super interesting to actually try to map the different perhaps even degrees of monumentalization or institutionalization of communist memory versus this just touristification or commodification as a form.
Thank you very much, everybody. I would like to close the section now. We are having lunch at Korba, just like yesterday, and today is probably going to be easier. Everybody knows where it is already, and we will reassemble at 2 o'clock punctually.